They say that memories are recreated each time we recall them. Perhaps in the same way, archaeological discoveries bring back the past so we too can recreate them in our present lives. The Institute of Nautical Archaeology was founded in 1972 by George Bass, who pioneered the new branch of science and created many of the tools and techniques for excavating underwater. Today, INA is an organization made up of some of the most experienced nautical archaeologists in the world. Our talented and involved board of directors drive archaeological fieldwork, research, and publications with their generous support. Together with our talented archaeologists, they're the team largely responsible for making INA a global leader in shipwreck archaeology. Another historic leap was made by INA recently at Istanbul in the region of Yenikapı. A large engineering project was forced to stop when they ran into archaeological artifacts. Unbeknownst to them at the time, the diggers had found Theodosius's lost port. Famous under the rule of Constantine the Great, the Byzantine port of Constantinople.
Istanbul lies on a fault zone, and earthquakes are common. They thought that the Yenikapı shipwrecks had sunk as a result of tsunami because the fault goes just outside of Yenikapı harbor area. But as the excavation progressed and the stratification of the site became more clear, it was obvious that a tsunami had hit the harbor, but it was only during the 6th century AD, not afterwards. Whereas all the shipwrecks we excavated there postdate the tsunami period. Consequently, I think all of the Yenikapı shipwrecks that we excavated, and most of the wrecks that have been excavated at the site, sank as a result of various violent storms. Well, at the time, we were in Istanbul during the summer working at the Naval Museum, recording one of the oldest historically preserved ships with my graduate students, Rebecca Ingram and Michael Jones, when a visitor came from Istanbul Archaeological Museums and told me about a discovery that they had made at Yenikapı. He told me about a ship that they were uncovering, probably from the 10th century, and the ship was so well preserved that it even had its mast in place. And it's very rare for an ancient ship to have its mast preserved. So, of course, my curiosity was piqued. He came back the following day and the day after that, and in the end, he said, "Sir, I thought this was your passion. Aren't you at all interested in coming out to Yenikapı to look at the site?" And I said, "Yes, I'm dying to come out, but you haven't invited me." So we went out there and looked into this deep pit. It was surrounded by a cofferdam because it was below sea level, so they had to pump the water out. And there lay this one side of a ship that had part of its cargo preserved, cargo of wine amphoras. And this was only one of 37 shipwrecks that was found there that had its cargo of amphoras. 2 others were found afterwards, so only 3 shipwrecks had their cargoes preserved. But as we went into the pit, I saw some more wooden components sticking out from the mud. And I asked my host as to what they were. And he said they did not know, but they assumed that it belonged to the deck of the ship, YK-1, that we're just looking at. But I looked at the timbers. They were quite small, thin, very closely spaced, and I knew that it was not a part of a deck because ships in those times did not have decks. I knew it was that of a galley. And if it were a galley, that would be some discovery because it would be the oldest, the only Byzantine galley ever found. And I was hit, and I had to be involved with that project.
The pressure to maintain progress on the construction project turned a methodical archaeological excavation into an emergency salvage. Jamal had to work fast, or the priceless archaeological discoveries would be lost forever. He enlisted the help of several other colleagues from INA's research center in Bodrum, Turkey. Rebecca Ingram, who at the time was working on her doctorate at Texas A&M University, took a large part in the project.
I had just completed my master's degree, and I would say it definitely was not up to me, but we were working with Dr. Jamal Pulak in the Naval Museum in Istanbul. And they were, of course, coming to get his expertise on the matter. And we were working with some graduate students in the Naval Museum. And he said, let's go over and take a look at this shipwreck. Of course, Jamal was very excited, especially seeing that there may be part of a galley right next to YK-1. And we were talking about how long it would take to get it out. We all thought a couple of months. I thought maybe it would take 4 months. And of course, we ended up being at the site for 3.5 years.
37 total wrecks were found in what became known as Istanbul's Big Dig. The effort included an estimated 750 workers excavating an area of 10 city blocks in 24-hour shifts, an excavation that was to become known as the greatest nautical archaeology site of all time. Putting aside the massive artifact inventory and preserved cargoes found on some of the ships, the site gave us the first Byzantine galleys ever found.
We would occasionally find material in the shipwrecks. One of them, the most exciting for me, was on YK-11, which is the wreck that I studied for my dissertation. I went down one morning early to clean up the wreck. We were going to do some photos that day. We keep water on overnight, so there was a lot of muddy water in the bilge, and so I'm trying to clean out the bottom of the hull. And I reach in and I feel what feels like somebody's keychain was in there, and it was Istanbul, so we would find a lot of interesting things that ended up in the shipwreck. But I reached in, I felt this kind of key ring, and I pulled it out and looked, and it was not a key ring. It was an almost perfectly preserved 7th century, early 7th century, possibly 6th century lamp hanger. So a bronze chain that would hold a lamp, and I was just amazed. It was so incredible to know that I'm the first person who was holding this in my hand after 1,400 years. And this was just a day of cleaning out the wreck to get some good photos. And this kind of thing was happening all over the site. We were finding these incredible things all over the archaeological site.
Because of their excellent preservation, we decided to excavate YK-1 and the galley YK-2. And then after that, we were going to be done with it and then leave to go down to Bodrum, to our center where we were working on other shipwrecks. But during the excavation process, additional wrecks were found, YK-3, YK-4, YK-5, and many, many more. And we got to see the other wrecks, and every shipwreck in some regard was different. So in the end, we focused on excavating, in addition to YK-1 and YK-2, we excavated another galley, YK-4, a merchantman YK-5, and then YK-11, YK-14, YK-23, and YK-24, a total of 8 shipwrecks. The YK-1 ship sank while it was at anchor. In fact, 2 of the ship's anchors were still on board. And as the storm broke the ship apart, the cargo of amphoras pressed the wooden components of the hull into the sand and sediment of the harbor and quickly buried them. And after recovering the amphoras, we saw how well the portion of the hull beneath it was preserved. And our part was to dismantle, record, and recover these artifacts and then conserve them for assembly in a museum later. After taking the ship apart, we realized that the ship had been built using both the ancient earlier technique of shell building and the later technique of skeletal building. So we found a gap, a missing link into the ship construction, which would lead to the modern method of shipbuilding that involved skeletal construction first. The hull itself was quite old. It had been repaired many times over, and in its last overhaul, 2 planks were added to the freeboard to increase its cargo carrying capacity. To be able to facilitate the loading and unloading of the ship, they had also supplied the ship on the starboard side with a mobile planking that could be removed for putting gangplanks to be able to load the ship. And as a result, we were able to determine how the technique of ancient ship construction changed or evolved in this shipwreck, which was completely different than the way I thought it had been built.
YK-2 was actually the first galley that was found at Yenikapı, so it was very exciting. This is probably a type of ship that the Byzantines called a galea, which was a small galley which probably had about 25 rowers per side. And what we had for YK-2 was only 1/2 of the ship's bottom preserved, and it was 14.5 meters long, the preserved section, which is about 50 feet.
As YK-2 began to be uncovered, we were seeing for the first time how a Byzantine galley was built for the first time. Only one side of the ship was preserved, but as we dismantled it, we realized the spacing of the framing or the ribs, their sizes, and also how this ship was built plank by plank, that is shell first, and assembled with fasteners that were inserted to the edges of the planking. So pretty much the shell of the galley had been built before the reinforcing frames or skeleton structures were inserted. While we were working on YK2, the galley, 3 additional shipwrecks were found. YK4 turned out to be another galley, but this galley, unlike YK2, was much better preserved. It had been split into 2, but both halves of the galley was there. We had the keel, we had the turn of bilge, and we had the side of the galley, and a portion of it was preserved all the way up to the cap rail, including the oar ports. This is a 1/5 scale model of the Yenikapı 4 ship. As we get toward the bow, this is the part where YK5, the merchant ship, had rammed into the vessel during the storm, destroying a part of the ship's port side, but at the same time preserving a portion toward the bow where the cap rail, almost up to the cap rail, was preserved, and we have the oar strake. That gives us the actual distance between the rowers as benches, as you can see here, which is critical because we have 25 rowers per side, which makes it a very long ship, and therefore it can be flexible. And to minimize that, you have to have an optimal distance between the rowers. It can't be too short so that the rowers can't develop their full stroke. It can't be too long because it'll make the ship excessively long, which will make it flexible and flimsy. So now for the first time, we have from an ancient ship, a medieval ship, an actual distance between the rowers. Not only that, but because we have the original oar ports preserved in place, we now know how high the oar ports are from the benches, and we know how far they're offset from the benches. These are the 3 critical dimensions that are needed to work out the full ergonomics of rowing in ancient times.
YK5 was a merchant ship which dates to around the 10th century. This was, I believe, about 15 meters, would have been around 15 meters in length, so about 50 feet in length originally. And it was a very boxy merchant ship. So again, at Yenikapı, we have a lot of different types of ships preserved, and this was great because it shows that is a little toward the newer techniques that we see, for example, using coats and using the framing pattern that's seen in the 9th or 10th century ships. YK11 dates to the early 7th century. This was actually the wreck that I studied for my doctoral dissertation. And of course, for me, it's the most fascinating ship at the site. This was the earliest wreck that we worked on at the site. And it was also found in the western end of the site, so the part that had become silted in earliest. And this probably was not a shipwreck. It was probably a derelict. It tells us a lot about this earlier phase in the transition from shell-based to skeleton-based shipbuilding. We had to disassemble the ships in order to remove them from the area, so this was something that was done out of necessity. But when you disassemble a ship, you have the opportunity to study aspects of the construction that you would never see in just a survey or something where the hull's not taken apart. For example, the edge fasteners. So YK11 was built with mortise and tenon edge fasteners, but because most of the planks had been replaced, when they replace a plank, they don't, of course, edge fasten it again, at least not by the 7th century. And so by taking it apart, we can see first what pieces are repair and what pieces are original, but it also gives us a great example of a heavily repaired ship that we can then compare with other ships that have been found throughout the Mediterranean. Of course, Yenikapı gave us this opportunity.
YK14 is a mystery ship because it is far sleeker, narrower than any of the other shipwrecks we excavated at Yenikapı. Obviously, it was meant for speed, but based on its characteristics, we can see that it is a cargo ship. What its ultimate purpose would have been, we do not know, but perhaps it was designed to be able to go against the currents of the Bosphorus, being very, very strong. The ship itself was exceptionally well preserved. At sea, we get only the bottom portion of the vessels, but here it was preserved well above the waterline and among the best preserved shipwrecks of the 37 found at Yenikapı. The lower part of the hull, up to the waterline, was built in a shell-first manner using edge fasteners, again in this case, of dowels, and then the framework was installed, and the remainder of the hull planking was fastened directly to the erected framework in the frame-first manner, thereby indicating a mixed construction. All of the excavation and engineering work done at Yeni Kapı is monitored by a team of archaeologists from Istanbul Archaeological Museums. One night, as I was sleeping in the excavation house, my door was rung and I opened it, and a team of archaeologists had brought in a blue crate filled with water with bits of wood, some as large as matchsticks. And they asked me, "Sir, could these parts belong to a shipwreck?" And I was sleepy, I couldn't see well, these little small fragments. I said, they just look like bits of wood to me. But eventually, I pulled them out from the container, looked at them carefully, saw where there had been edge fasteners and nail holes, and I concluded that they were from a shipwreck, and that their borer had in fact gone through an ancient ship.
YK-23 was, of course, very challenging because we had these big 4 or 5 foot diameter concrete pillars right through the best preserved side of the wreck. Actually got a nickname on the site because these pillars looked like smokestacks, so it got the nickname of Titanic. We were pulling little fragments of wood off the side of the pillars, which of course had bits of concrete still on it. It was a cargo ship, and it's special because it dates to a period, the 8th century, when we have very few other shipwrecks. It's a mix. We have an earlier framing pattern with the newer edge fastening method of coax. YK-23 was about a century later than YK-11, so we're talking 8th century, and this is really important because we don't have a lot of shipwrecks from that period. This was a very heavily built vessel. It had massive framing timbers and an enormous keel. We just had a fragment of the keel, but it probably weighed about 500 pounds. And of course, we had a small team. It's very difficult to move something that's so heavy and delicate at the same time. So what we ended up doing was flooding the cofferdam and floating it into a specially made box.
One of the last shipwrecks that we excavated at Yeni Kapı was YK-24, dating to the 10th century. This was the least well preserved of all the shipwrecks we excavated, but every shipwreck has a story to tell. In this instance, the ship was in the way of the construction, and we were asked to remove the ship as fast as possible. Seeing how poorly preserved the ship was, and also that it had been used extensively during its lifetime, and the planks had been worn down to half their original thickness, we decided to remove the planking in one piece, otherwise the ship just would simply disintegrate. So we made a large pallet, inserted it underneath the planking, and raised the planking as a whole. But in the excavation, as we dismantled the rest of the ship, we realized that the ship's entire keel had been dropped and replaced in a very flimsy manner, and the ship probably would not have lasted much if it had not sunk as a result of that change. One interesting aspect of this ship was that this was the only shipwreck on which I saw human remains. But as the excavation progressed, we realized that there were human remains around in the vicinity of the shipwreck as well as in other places, so it became clear that these human bones were not from the shipwrecks, but rather from Byzantine cemeteries that had been washed out from torrential rainstorms, and the bones deposited in the harbor, and in some instances on shipwrecks like YK-24.
The 8 ships studied by the INA team confirm that the medieval period was a rich, diverse, and exciting period in shipbuilding. One more sophisticated than previously thought. These wrecks tell the story of a dynamic culture of shipbuilding methods that adjusted to economic and political times. They reveal an evolutionary technology that maintained earlier traditions. Researchers from the Institute of Nautical Archaeology found innovative alterations and repairs that reveal a culture open to innovation. Collectively, the site at Yeni Kapı offers a glimpse into one of Constantinople's most important harbors. Like an airport, here, vessels of all sizes, forms, and types commingled. The vast historical scope spanned by these shipwrecks makes it possible to observe trends in Byzantine maritime activity over the course of half a millennium. The wrecks and the hundreds of artifacts are currently undergoing thorough conservation at INA's Research Center and Lab in Bodrum. A museum exhibit awaits their reconstruction as part of a special display offering thrilling details about their history and build methodology, and we've only touched the surface. The site at Yeni Kapı will continue to offer the world decades of exciting answers to mysteries that span over 500 years.